Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, stories, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out the articles, videos, and more at passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, join the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Passive House podcast. It's great to have you here listening to us. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh. I'm coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand, and pleased to be chatting with Zach and also Sydney today. Zach, how are you doing? Where are you coming from?
I'm doing great. I'm in Seattle. It's rainy and dark, and everything's getting green. Whereas staying green, so that's all good.
And Sydney, nice to have you with us today as well. How's things in New York?
It's good. It's the first snow today in New York City, which is exciting. Yeah. Everyone's preparing for the winter. Yeah.
White Christmas coming up. All right. Well, it's great to have you here today, Sydney, because you actually helped organise and do the feature interview today. So we're going to hear more of your voice, and we'll come back and check in after the interview. But Zach, why don't you go ahead and give us an introduction to Julie?
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited to have this interview with Julie Torres Moskowitz. And Julie has been a leader in the Passive House movement in the U.S. Since really the early days. Which means, way back 10 years ago. And has she's been a speaker and leading voice at conferences in North America during those years. She's also an educator, and in the interview that we're going to hear with Sydney and Julie and myself, she'll talk about her approach to education and engagement in social justice and architecture and climate action. It's really inspiring stuff. In the interview, she speaks about Local Law 97. And so I just want to give listeners a little background about Local Law 97 in New York City. It was passed in 2019 as part of the Climate Mobilization Act by the New York City Council. And it requires large buildings, so buildings that are over 25,000 square feet in 2017. So large existing buildings in New York City to reduce their emissions by 40%, their greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. So we often talk about the importance of how important it is to retrofit buildings to deal with climate mitigation. And New York City is a global leader now in requiring building owners to do that with their buildings. It's a huge deal. And Passive House is an important way to get there. So we refer to that. And then also Julie talks about landmark buildings, and that's another way of saying historically significant buildings. And there are, review boards that protect the historically significant buildings in the city. So with that, let's listen to Sydney and my interview with Julie.
One of my first questions is about one of the first certified Passive House projects that you completed in New York City. And underneath, this is your company, right? FNA, Fete Nature Architecture. So yeah, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that first project and how you were able to get that certified, and also kind of the area that's in it. I am not even sure which borough that's in or what geographic area.
So that was a project we started. It was a family. Oftentimes it's like someone's pregnant and that's like what's bringing on the project. So that was the case there. By the time the project was done, I think they had 2 kids. But in 2010, we started working with them. It was a full gut renovation of an 1899 row house in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It was in a district that was not landmarked, although today it is landmarked. So it became a landmark district later. That gave us an advantage, actually, that it wasn't landmarked. So they collected art and they were growing families, so they wanted to expand the square footage. So it was a hybrid of a retrofit and also adding an addition on the top floor. They introduced the idea, they hired me for sustainability, but then it was in 2010, they were doing their own research online and heard of Passive House. And so they asked if I could do that. And then I quickly started to network and figure out what Passive House was. There was, at the time, I feel like it was Ken Levinson in New York and Sam, part of Loading Dock 5, who's an old friend from Williamsburg. I knew that he was working on a Passive House. So I reached out to the network and there was one job site I could visit that was Jeremy Shannon's site, a brownstone in Brooklyn, and then spoke to Ken and Sam and started to learn about it and then figure out that, let's do this. Let's get trained in Passive House and agreed. I also wanted to find an engineer that could help with the mechanical engineering and understood Passive House. So that's when I found Jordan Goldman from Zero Energy Design, who's a friend of mine. And I mean, now he's a friend, like years later, but we work, he often consults on our projects. So I found him, which was great because I knew if I found another architect, I might get pushed out of the commission, for too many architects at the table. So it was nice that Jordan's based in Brooklyn, although his architect partner's in Boston. And so he was just going to consult on the Passive House portion with us and the mechanical design in particular. So that was 2010. We started working, got really into it, and even got invited. Well, maybe I invited myself. It was like a little group. No, Tim McDonald got me invited to a small group where we were trained in Dublin, a tradesman training. It was 2012, January 2012, I think, or 2011. And so we went to, we knew we were certifying with PHI, but they offered a tradesman training and there were 14 of us. All of us, I think, have continued on in Passive House in various ways and a lot of leaders in that group. I was lucky to be part of it because my contractor at that very moment was starting to, we were getting the Passive House windows from Europe, Schuco, and we were trying to figure out how to make the building airtight. So it was perfect timing. I was trained in January in Passive House, and then I literally got off the plane and we did a blower door test and airtightness, taping and sealing around one window in one room of that house. And that helped set the stage for getting to the airtightness we needed. We used the blower door test to check ourselves. And we had a pizza party, blower door party, I remember. And at that time, maybe it's the same, a little different with COVID, but there were many enthusiastic Passive House fans. So I think maybe there were 50 people at the pizza party. And and you could all walk around the building and like feel where air was leaking. And I had people helping to seal more while the blower door test was on. And I can't remember exactly if at that, we had accomplished tighter than 0.6. So we were already at Passive House levels on the retrofit at that point. And that was good news. The contractor, we didn't even tell him the difference between Enerfit and just Passive House. And at the time, I don't think the distinction was quite so clear in 2011, 2012. Mm-hmm. And so we just wanted to achieve get Passive House certified. Another part I'll explain is that I was also writing a book. I had pitched a book to Princeton Architectural Press on Passive House. And so I was collecting 18 case studies of either contractors, different innovators, owners, architects, engineers that were working in Passive House. And so the process was really interesting of writing the book while I was trying to figure it out. It also added pressure onto me that I wanted to make sure we were certified. I was afraid to have a book called Passive House and Wolfgang Feist. I wanted to make sure he was like considered a Passive House. So I wanted to have everything certified if I could. It ended up a few of the projects in the book are not certified, but most of them are, including ours. So it was like extra double pressure on us. Mm-hmm. And we were certified in 2012.
Okay.
That's great. And for listeners, most listeners probably are aware, but you were talking about the 0.6, that you were better than 0.6 ACH at 50 pascals, right? I think is the measure, and that's enough to be Passive House certified, free and clear. And then the Interfit standard is slightly more permissive. It's 1.0 ACH at 50 pascals. So recognizing that retrofits can be really difficult to make airtight. So that's pretty impressive that you were at that level of airtightness. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was good. I have the exact number in my book because that was a bonus of writing a book, was that we were in one of the chapters. And there's a appendix that lists all the data on the Passive House achievements, including airtightness. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but we achieved better than the 0.6 actually. But it was helpful. One of the things I learned from writing the book was that you could use the blower door test sort of as a science experiment to achieve airtightness and test what it felt like in a construction site. Whereas we learned the European Passive House architects that had done 3 or 4 of them already didn't need the blower door test necessarily incrementally along the way. So that was a takeaway, and I feel better for having done a couple of those tests during construction to understand for future work that I've done since where we are with airtightness, because we experimented, and you can equate the amount of leakiness with what the blower door test is achieving. So that was one interesting point.
When you were able to get it certified, did you notice that were there other certifications within Brooklyn that you had noticed, or was this like one of the first?
No, this one, it was the first.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I haven't had anyone say it wasn't. I was pretty plugged in at that point because I was writing a book and interviewing everyone. So I knew there were, and I was teaching a course from 2016 to 2018, I think, local law 34 on public buildings that have to achieve 50% better than energy code. So during that phase, I also mapped all the projects from 2010 that were in the works that were Passive House, and then mapped 2018 to show that we had 1 million square feet of Passive House or more under construction then. So I had done a lot of research, and in 2010 there were 12 projects underway, more or less. That most of them were brownstone retrofits. 2 of them were solar decathlon projects, one at Parsons, one at Stevens Institute of Technology in Jersey City, or right over the water in Jersey. And then Chris Benedict had 2 in the works affordable housing projects in Bushwick. Mm. So that was like the milieu of what we were working in, and everyone was kind of talking to each other and sharing information. So there were Chris Benedict's 2 large affordable housing projects. Maybe they had just started, and then there were about 12 brownstones and the 2 universities. So and then it expanded, and I show in 2018, by then it was landmarks I mapped out. There were over 38 passive house projects that went through landmarks. Some of them may have just been windows and doors being retrofitted. They weren't necessarily certified, but they had all gone through landmarks. And at that point, New York City landmarks made it a staff level decision to receive approval on passive house windows. Because I went on to work on a landmark project that has passive house windows and doors, and I had to go to a community board meeting and a public hearing to get approved. And now that's much easier today in New York City. So those were other projects underway. Then probably the second certified one was on the North Fork, an artist studio that's also in my book.
Great. Okay.
By Rael Porter, architects.
Do you have a question, Zach?
Oh, I was just going to say that am I understanding correctly then of that move by landmarks to allow that to be a staff level decision? Is that functionally then kind of an incentive for passive house, or just the removal of an obstacle that was really frustrating? Is it, does it?
I think it's an incentive because to any architect explaining it to their client, it would save them money, right? And time. It took me it takes a month or more to get a meeting time with a community board, and then the public hearings maybe 6 weeks after that, and it's lots of presentation material carefully exhibited. So it's a lot less fussiness that has to happen. So I think it's a bonus. One interesting thing on both these projects, because I think it speaks to the strength of neighborhoods and neighbors speaking to one another. So the site of our first certified passive house, there's 2 or 3 other passive house projects on the block, at least 2 that are certified just on that very block. And I think that's an example of neighbors talking to one another. When I went through landmarks with the landmarked passive house project that actually finished recently, it 2 doors down is Sam, the loading dock 5. I remember he had done a landmarked project passive house. So 2 doors down from my passive house clients is his passive house corner project. So you start to see it feels in Brooklyn that you're connecting, and neighborhoods seem to bunch passive houses together.
When I don't know too much about your classes, but when you're conveying some of these methods and also teaching architecture classes, have you had to really concerning the COVID pandemic, have you really had to change the way that you're teaching certain methods versus if you were teaching in person?
I think the first one is, how do you bring passive house into teaching architecture? Because it wasn't there, right? When I went to grad school, I wanted to do sustainability. It was 1997 to 2000. There was nothing about passive house in my grad program. There was nothing even about sustainability. And I realized at that point, I just had to learn concept and structure and mechanical, and then come back around. So it took me a long time to come back around, because there's a lot of education and built work and just learning and finding your own path. So I wanted to commit to, when I teach architecture and related seminars, that I'm giving the students a shortcut, because we don't have time to learn bad ways of building. We want to learn the best way. So I taught environmental tech at Pratt and Parsons and Syracuse. And I also teach some courses at the Center for Architecture at the AIA for professionals, engineers, and architects. But how do you get to passive house right away first for those students, so they just learn that? And then they can be influencers out to their firm that they work for, or to their studio professor, or if they go out on their own, they just know what's available. So that's been getting deeper and deeper, and I think more interesting, as I've taught environmental tech for 4 years. And now this class I made up called Eco-Urban Seminar, that is about energy, which is building envelope, urban resiliency, about, buildings being resilient, but also social resiliency, social justice, and then waste and recycling that I've now paired with food justice, food equity issues. And so in that energy sector, I take the students, normally we go out on field trips. This gets to your COVID question. We could do field trips all over New York City and use it as a lab, which I could not do since COVID started. But we would go up to the Bronx, to the Affordable Association for Affordable Energy Affordability. And they worked with a built-out room where we do a blower door test. And so the students are learning about Passive House there and seeing all the equipment and the tape and actually doing the testing. And then I've done a series that I love and I want to get back to, which is thermal imagery around the city. So the students one semester they studied different neighborhoods via thermal imagery and understanding how buildings are leaking. Another semester they studied industrial business zones because we were working with a team in the Bronx for green jobs. And the students were going out to these different industrial business zones and taking photos of thermal imagery of industrial buildings and showing how those envelopes are leaking. And right before COVID in February 2020, the students, it's ironic, they looked at restaurants, grocery stores, and hotels around the city as themes and took thermal imagery of those. And then those were buildings that shut down like a few months later altogether. But I think that thermal imagery is one area that I really push, and it's with the FLIR camera. The students can't all own a FLIR camera, so this semester I had to do a washed down like mini test of an app that didn't have a FLIR attachment. But I find that the thermal imagery, and I'll tell you where it originated. The Sam McAfee took a thermal image of the Tight House, 23 Park Place, that kind of went a little bit viral at least in energy efficiency world. And he took it because his project was 2 doors down going under a renovation, and he wanted to take another photo after he finished his, and there would be 2 passive houses on the street. So you see brownstones in red leaking out of windows and cornices, and then ours is blue, and the windows and doors are pretty much not leaking. And I realized the power of that thermal image there was almost worth more than my 30,000 words in my Passive House book. So I've just been passing that on to students with education and letting them understand like how many buildings, no matter what decade they're built in, like how inefficient they are and how we can improve. So in terms of COVID, that's one example. I can't run out with the FLIR camera because I can't have students buying FLIRs or renting FLIRs. And I can't have them running out to the workshop, hands-on workshop in the Bronx. But we did do deeper dives into readings and becoming more aligned with community engagement projects and having guest speakers join in the class. And then I took it to task. Like I just got stronger about the mission, as my architecture firm's mission has become more clear too, that we focus on 3 pillars like passive house and energy efficiency, urban resiliency, whether it's recovery from Hurricane Sandy or other natural disasters, and then social justice, social equity issues. So I try those are all topics I would have loved to have had in school and interested me, but it wasn't there. And I'm trying to make sure it's there for students. And I find they're really receptive to it. So yeah, I hope that answers.
Yeah. No, those classes sound so interesting to me, actually. And I have never taken an architecture course before, but those sound very interesting, especially the last one, the social justice and social equity.
Yeah, it's good because we do a mix of, we do the thermal imagery as one research project, but we also do like they worked for East New York Farm.
Mhm.
How can you engage? And like the problem is, for example, the farmers market has no foot traffic. How can you help this community in East New York? How do you help the vendors to survive, to make a living and vend? And how do you get people to know about the market?
Mhm.
And I feel like architect students have the tools. And one of my messages is to not wait until your boss tells you like it's time to help this client, but there's plenty architecture students can do just with their abilities. It might be as simple as graphic design, signage, DIY solutions, combined with like larger, bigger ideas and policy. So another big component of the class is learning about policy and how you can, as an architect with a small practice, do one passive house at a time, or you can work like how one of the guest speakers, Colin Schlessel from Thornton Tomasetti, showed that they consulted with the city of Boston and they have a whole program for reaching net zero for retrofitting all scales of buildings. And then similarly with local law 97, that's in New York City, getting ready for carbon tax penalties. I think real quickly, a lot of buildings, 25,000 square feet, are going to be pushed to become energy efficient. And that brings about huge change. So I try and show the students that policy is like architecture is political, and how much change you can affect on a policy level by contributing as like an activist architecture practitioner. So,
And you mentioned that earlier that you have an upcoming class that's going to focus on local law 97, right?
yeah, so I was saying I was invited from a colleague, Lori Kerr, who's architect in a passive house, or not passive house, but she's an architect who's a policy expert. I think she was even head of environmental policy or sustainability under the New York City Mayor Bloomberg for a while. So she received a grant with NYSERDA and with Paul Reel, who's with the CUNY Performance Lab. They created a curriculum, and it's just started being offered in November, and I'm going to teach a class in December. It's for local law 97 and reducing carbon and complying with it, which is all buildings over 25,000 square feet that exist having to retrofit and become energy efficient. Otherwise, the buildings landlords are going to face big carbon penalties. And in fact, city council, even though we're in a recession, they also added in, there was sort of a loophole if buildings had more than one, or I think even one rent subsidized apartment, they could get out of doing the green retrofit. But city council voted last month that those buildings still have to be in on local law 97, which adds a lot more buildings.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I think it's real quickly. We're all going to be learning about carbon, and because it's going to have a penalty associated with it. So
yeah.
And passive house isn't specifically cited in local 97 law 97. Is that right?
I don't think.
Yeah. I know there's.
I'd have to read through to say them, but I do know that it's one of the methods, just like the other class I taught, where it's like, okay, we know passive house will get you there.
Yeah.
We know triple glazed windows will get you there, and if they're installed well. So it's sort of part of the discussion, definitely part of the discussion.
Right.
Yeah.
Another thing in New York City that's crazy interesting, I'm going to have my students do a study of it, is as of October 31st, you're supposed to have your grade on your building for energy performance, and many of the buildings around me have a D grade in their lobbies, and I just think it's such a good discussion to have with condo owners who have maybe had no idea how their building was performing, and now there's a D grade. Doesn't look good. I think the average grade is D. So,
wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I feel like,
yeah, I mean, building energy use is just something that people, I think it's easy not to think about when you're thinking about the components, the pieces of our lives that drive the climate crisis. So that does seem like a really powerful signal.
I guess I think it's called Local Law 84. It required larger buildings to benchmark and share their data online, but the average person never checked it. I don't even know how to check it. Maybe some architects are checking it, but most people have no idea. But putting it front and center in the lobby window is bringing it center to everyone's mind, which I think is really powerful.
It's interesting, like, not to generalize New York City landlords, but they kind of have a reputation of just, I mean, at least from like different experiences, of kind of trying to save money in certain ways that they can, especially like, at least from what I've seen or like experiences I've heard from people. So I feel like having a penalty, like a financial penalty, will really change the way that landlords interact with their buildings.
I also think in New York, at least, tenants know gas is cheaper to run. Like, I have a gas heater back there. But we're all trying to electrify buildings. So many of my clients come to me and they're just taking out fossil fuel gas altogether. Like, that's pretty much what my office, all of our brownstone retrofits, gas is going away. But for tenants, how do you get there? And if the gas heater is cheaper to run and you're in a building like mine where there's no insulation and the windows are leaky, it's hard to want electric Mitsubishi split system if you have no way to make your building airtight and add insulation, right? Because then you're going to be paying more money and not comfortable. It's going to be drafty. So I think getting these larger buildings to that have tenants in them to become hopefully passive house, but at least follow this path so that they're not getting carbon penalties. And we're trying to electrify in New York because I guess Governor Cuomo said by 2050 that our grid's going to be carbon neutral. So getting people onto electric and then figuring out how to make the grid better performing is one goal, like across the city.
I didn't know it says it's one of the most ambitious laws created by any city within.
Well, I do have to say these cities all brag a lot.
Yeah.
On who they are, and I like it. It's basically competition, right? I remember going to a conference in Seattle, like you're competing with Vancouver, maybe Portland, I don't know, but Vancouver's going passive house fast, and
Vancouver makes Seattle and Portland look far behind the times on energy. Yeah.
And now that I know about Boston from the Thornton Tomasetti study, then it's like, okay, Boston, New York, you guys are competing. There's friendly competition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
But they all seem to think they're the best at it.
I'm sure.
Yeah, well, if you have so on the social justice and social equity front, because I know you've Julie, you've done a lot of thinking about this. Do you have any advice for the passive house architect, who maybe isn't is thinking about Black Lives Matter and thinking about their practice and recognizing that they like to be part of solution making? What advice would you give to a practitioner like that?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. It's probably the advice I give my students. Like, I have them read Whitney Young Jr. in 1968 convention speech in Portland to architects, where he said, "You're completely irrelevant." And so I don't want to be irrelevant. I want to be relevant, right? So I want to be relevant in terms of preventing climate change and bringing social justice and all forms of resiliency. So just making that, just kind of always realigning your practice to remember that and keep pushing yourself. So the social justice work, a lot of times the community engagement work is just, shall I say, pro bono, like I'm on advisory boards and I get involved and I'm going to actions. I'm trying to get policy passed, but I'm also, all these design issues come up. Like I work with women, street vendors, or just, they need safe spaces. They need public safe plazas. Though you can incorporate, they need commissaries where they store their carts. You can always work in the energy efficiency. What I've noticed is that I work with a construction cost estimator on my projects, primarily residential, but everyone's doing passive house or passive house strategy. And at this point, the cost estimator says there's not really extra cost for the energy efficiency part, because our 2020 energy code is already forcing you to do a certain amount. That's good to see, because that wasn't the case 5-10 years ago. It was saying it was 3%, 4%, 8% more. Now it's a wash, and that's not the factor that's causing your building to be expensive. So I think just, and then also knowing that if you're in the city, I would love to get on the list for the city where you're building libraries and public projects. And we have the local laws in place that are forcing those buildings, and it's in effect now. It took a while to get there, but now anything in design that's going to happen has to be 50% better energy performing than code. So just by being on the city list to work on city projects, public spaces, you are going to be doing energy efficiency too. So those are all, I think giving in your time and expertise and taking part in advisory boards and meeting with community and, I find that I'd much rather do that for community than give away free to developers. I noticed a lot of architects doing free designs for developers that their bottom line is just possibly making money, the most money they can. I don't know why architects would do that. Like, I'd much rather give my time and expertise and my staff time to a community vision that brings social change. Because if, I can't do that everywhere because I got to earn a living and keep my staff going. But I can choose, instead of doing a random competition, I can choose to work with a real community group and help them envision future building space or plaza or whatever they need. So I just recommend that, like curating and choosing on purpose, like helping community rather than helping someone who probably doesn't need the free help.
I see. It seems great that you could take your students on different field trips, like throughout the boroughs, just so that they could see different buildings and just see kind of like the differences. Like you were saying, you were taking your students to the Bronx and different areas.
We go visit. Yeah. We learn about huge infrastructure too. We have Sunset Park has the recycle center. Yeah. We have that near me is the Newtown Creek, which has biofuel and food waste pilot program. So having the students also learn about this kind of infrastructure that's has to do with how cities operate, but is not covered in design studios. But it's important to understand, like, okay, my wastewater's going here, and this is what happens to it, and it ends up back in the East River, and here's what happens to the part that's broken down and becomes compost or fertilizer. So just understanding holistically these opportunities to, I guess, get towards circular economy and thinking in bigger vision besides just your one building, but how it fits into the puzzle of the city. So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
You should sign up for the architecture studio or something, Sydney.
Yeah, I love architecture. I don't really know too much about it, but I'm always admiring buildings throughout the city. I think New York has some of the most beautiful architecture.
But then take a thermal image of it and see if you still.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my point is the city is sort of leading the way. City council and 36 of the 51 members of city council are up for. They're like, they can't even run again next year. There's going to be a whole new group, and I think it's going to be very progressive. So, I think it's going to accelerate, is my guess, after the city council elections next year.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Right. So it seems like on one hand, some people might not want to run because we're in a recession, the city's broke, the state's broke, but I think laying the foundation for building a better, more equitable city could be a really powerful move of the new city council.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thank you so much for your talk today. And Zach, if you have any more details that you want to ask about or...
No, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Julie. Appreciate it.
And that was Julie Moskowitz there. A great interview, guys. Really enjoyed that, listening to the conversation there. Just before we jump into some of the breakdown, you can check out some of Julie's great work. She's online on Instagram, all over social media, but also their website is FN. Is it FM? FN.
FN. N for nature.
FN, yes, FN, because it is nature. FNarchitecture.com. Check that out. And there's some great links and some resources there, as well as some beautiful images of some of the work that she's been involved in. Now, at the top of the show, I mentioned that we have both Zach and Sydney here, but we failed to introduce Sydney properly. We've mentioned Sydney a few times because she's done some great work putting these podcasts together. So it's really nice to hear your voice on the show, Sydney. Why don't you give us a little bit of an update on what you're up to and your interest, because you mentioned a little bit during the interview that you love architecture, but you're not an architect.
No. I'm learning a lot this semester from all of you at Passive House Accelerator, which is really great. I am in my last semester at NYU journalism program. I've been interning with Passive House for the last about 5 months now, which is like really great. It's been a really great long time with everyone there that I've really enjoyed. I am really, I would say, learning about podcasting and podcast editing. And also I've been doing a few internships here in New York City that has to do with radio, podcast editing. Before I interned with Zach Semke, I was interning with CBS Radio for a while here in New York. So that was really exciting before the COVID pandemic kind of, hit New York City and the rest of the world. And yeah, I really enjoy, helping out with the podcast. And also I think it helps me look at buildings throughout New York, like a lot differently. And I can kind of see how, environmentalism and like carbon emissions kind of relate to some of these old buildings that are getting remodeled throughout New York. So I feel like it's really helped me a lot. At least it helps me look at architecture a lot differently.
I love at one point during this conversation when you asked Julie about which a particular building and said, do you want to know? Because you can go and check it out. I love that.
Yeah,
you can walk down the road and have a look at some of these in real life.
Yeah, Julie and Michael Ingley are always telling me about cool buildings. I haven't gone to check out a lot of them, to be honest, just because I've been so busy, but I'm hoping to check out some of them. Michael Ingley and Julie probably don't live too far away. They both work on buildings in Brooklyn, which has a really long history of, having some of the oldest buildings, but a lot of Passive House has like infiltrated Brooklyn now. So I would say that that's a good segue into Julie, because she's been, I would say, like innovating a lot of Passive House, like, what do you call them? Renovations in Brooklyn. So
renovations, retrofits, remodeling. Yeah. I mean, you started out this conversation talking about, what was it, an 1890 brownstone building
on brownstones in Brooklyn, which I've noticed a lot of Passive passive house people have been working on brownstones because they're some of the oldest monuments like here in Brooklyn. So yeah.
And I think it's worth just pausing and thinking about that, because when we build, some of our building requirements here have durability requirements of materials, particularly on the outside of the building, of 15 years, is 15. And we think of our building lifespan being maybe a maximum of 50 years. But we're talking here about upgrading beautiful buildings that are coming up 130 years old. That's just incredible. And that's going to be relevant everywhere. And it's a challenge, but it's so awesome to hear that people are doing this and doing it successfully. And also retaining some of that beauty. And it's really cool, I think, to hear people like yourself. And I'm not an architect either. I'm trained as an engineer, but I'm learning more and more to appreciate the aesthetic of buildings and the beauty. And I think that's a really important part, that we don't just get bogged down in the nuts and bolts and the airtightness and all that cool building science stuff, but we also think about how these buildings form a part of the city and the community.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And like, that's what Henry and Chris would talk to us about, at the
Chris Benedict?
Yeah, Chris Benedict and Henry talked to us, a lot about how some of these oldest buildings or oldest areas are kind of in the most need of passive house retrofit, just because they have such old, electrical wiring or old plumbing, and they're kind of some of the buildings in New York that are the most need of it. Yeah. So I think it's really important that people like Julie too are looking at these really old brownstones and they're still able to keep them, which like New York does want a lot of these historical places, but they also want to make sure that there's less carbon emissions, or like less, less going out. So I think it's important to keep the aesthetic of the buildings, because I don't think New York really wants a lot of like cookie cutter looking places to be all put together. So yeah.
Zach, what were your outtakes from that interview?
I really appreciated her work with students, and the notion, instilling instilling the value. It's probably more encouraging a value that many young people already have, which is to not wait for your boss to give you permission to do the right thing. And so I really enjoyed listening to her about the ways that she's the kind of toolbox of actions that she's sharing with students to make a difference, and that we don't have time to learn how to do buildings wrong. We need to jump straight to the right way to do buildings.
Yeah, I love both of those sentiments. It's why teach us stuff that is going to be redundant. Just jump straight into the good stuff. And don't wait for permission. I really like that. In a similar vein, she also talked about the action that's happening at the city level, and a bit of healthy competition there between. I know New York, rightly so. New Yorkers love New York and brag about it, and so do people in Portland and all that. And I think it's great to have this. People actually competing to be the most energy efficient, regardless of what the federal government's doing or what the sort of higher up regulations are doing. It's this is where the action is happening at the city level, and I think that's happening globally as well.
It's really true. Actually, tonight, as of this interview, by the time this podcast is published, it'll have been a couple of days ago. But tonight we have Chris Higgins from the city of Vancouver talking about what's been going on there with passive house and climate mitigation. And he ran through the presentation with us yesterday. It's amazing. It's so inspiring to see what that city is accomplishing, and the knock-on effects, and kind of the proof of concept that can provide to other jurisdictions. So listeners, you'll be able to access the recorded presentation of Chris Higgins from the city of Vancouver soon.
One technical point from me, I'd like to do a bit of a plug for blower door testing. And I thought it was really interesting with Julie talking about how she found and used blower doors to be a great tool during the process of building, particularly for those early buildings. So they weren't just doing it for the certification, but they're actually doing it for the quality control. But she also said that when the Europeans were working on site, and once they got a better understanding of where the important aspects of the envelope were, they don't necessarily need to do that as much. They have confidence in their processes, so they just come along and do a blower door test at the end. So I think that's a really good point. If you're starting out on this journey, it's great to have access to a blower door and use it for quality control during the construction. And then you'll get to know where the most likely leaky points are, so that you can just basically turn up with a blower door, get someone to come and do a certification test or a pre-lining test to start, and then a certification test at the end. But she obviously had great success with that. Also, with the use of thermal imaging, I find that really interesting as well, and using that as a scientific tool, but also as a marketing tool, and to really highlight the performance gap between a building that's had attention put on it versus a stock standard, in that case, another brownstone, a row of brownstone buildings that are leaky.
Yeah, and the image that she referred to, the therm image that's become so famous by Sam McAfee, I'll make sure to include a link to that image in show notes in case folks haven't seen it, because it is really remarkable. You're seeing this therm image of a street of brownstones, and right in the center is this perfectly insulated blue brownstone surrounded by hot, energy leaking neighbors. It's really remarkable.
That's really interesting.
Any other outtakes from you, Sydney?
Yeah, she also talks about how, she's been a teacher at Pratt Institute many years ago, and now she's teaching a virtual class through Syracuse University. And while she does teach a lot of architecture-based classes, she also just teaches classes that are like architecture and social justice intertwined, which I thought was really interesting. I can't really say to the extent what the syllabus is like because I don't know, the entire class, but she did say that it really something like it teaches architects to have like community involvement in the neighborhoods that they're building within. So I think it's really cool that she's just such an interesting architect in the way that she can intertwine those two subjects. Which a lot of people don't really think about how social justice could intertwine, but I think it's really important. So,
Yeah, no, I really, that was quite strong. Came out a number of times, the social justice and also resilience. And I think that also goes to show that Passive House is such a good foundation for good building, but also good urban design and just good planning. And that once you have the core performance that affords good health and a good building, you can add things onto that are beneficial to the whole community and just sustainability in general. But it's a really Passive House is just such a good starting point to allow all that to happen around it as well. Some really great stuff in there. I'm so glad that you have access to that we have access to all these great people to hear about on the show. It's awesome to get this
Julie's
inspiration.
Really great. She is a great model in her community and also just a really great builder. She's a great person. So
thanks for making that happen, Sydney.
Yeah. And of course, we should do a plug for Julie's book as well. Are you able to put the links up for?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. We'll include those in show notes. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great idea.
Awesome. And it's getting towards the end of 2020 for a lot of us as recording this, but there's still plenty of stuff going on. So give us a quick rundown, Zach.
Yeah, a quick rundown. So on Monday, December 14th, the day that this episode goes live, the Passive House Accelerator is producing the Passive House Prefab Summit number 2. So please join us. It's going to have 6 new manufacturers in North America talking about prefab and Passive House. The summit sponsors are VaproShield and RDH Building Science. We were filled to capacity on our first summit. We've increased our capacity for this second summit, so don't worry about being able to get in. We'll have space for you, and come join us with a few hundred of your compatriots to learn about prefab in Passive House. On Tuesday, we'll have, which is Wednesday in Australia and New Zealand. Thank you for that note in social media, Matthew, the other day. We have Passive House Construction Tech Tuesday, and that is going to include a mystery guest prefab all-star who will present about their work on Construction Tech Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, the Global Passive House Happy Hour will feature a conversation led by Dan Nall, who is the chair of the ASHRAE committee that is focused on something called ASHRAE 227. And that sounds very wonky, but it's actually really important. ASHRAE is the organization that sets standards that building codes refer to, has a tremendous amount of authority and scientific rigor and power, frankly. And 227 will be a passive building standard that ASHRAE is creating. And they're creating it by working with PHI and with FIAS and with other building scientists and practitioners. So we're going to learn all about that on the Wednesday happy hour. Yeah. And we have lots of educational programming around the world that I'll share in show notes as well.
Awesome. So much happening. Thank you for that, Zach. Thanks again, Sydney, for organising and conducting this interview. And thanks again as well for all the great work that you've been doing over the last 5-6 months. It's so good to have you there helping in the background, putting all these podcasts together.
I've learned so much too. I really have.
Good. That's what we're all about. If you have any comments, thoughts, feedback, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us at podcast@passivehouseaccelerator.com. And that's it, I think, for this week. We'll see you back again with some more great interviews next week on Passive House Accelerator.
The Passive House podcast and all of the programs of Passive House Accelerator are made possible by generous support from our sponsors. So I want to say thank you to them. Our founding sponsors are Baxt Inqui Architects, Mitsubishi Electric Trane HVAC US, RDH Building Science, StoCorp, and Zola Windows. And our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy and Research Development Authority. Thank you.